Welcome to Mother's Revenge, where heartfelt stories touch your soul and may even bring you to tears. My father used to say teaching was not a real career, just something people did when they were not good enough for anything else. And at his medical gala, standing under a chandelier that probably cost more than my monthly rent, he introduced me to 320 guests as my son, who teaches preschool, basically babysitting. They laughed, all of them. The kind of laughter that strips the dignity off your skin. That was when the room shifted. The chair of the Ellington Foundation walked up to the microphone, looked straight at my father, and said, "Interesting introduction, Dr. Walker. Now let me tell everyone here who your son really is. You might want to sit down." In that moment, the world did not just stop, it turned. My name is Adam Walker, and this is the part of my life I never thought I would say out loud. Before I share my story, I want to know you are here with me. Just say, listening in the comments, or tell me where you are. I love hearing how far my story can reach. Sometimes, even the smallest connection can make a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here is my story. And if my voice means something to you, if you have ever felt dismissed, belittled, or underestimated, I would be grateful if you subscribed. It helps more people like us find a place where our stories matter. Thank you for being here. The night my father shattered whatever was left of my dignity began under the warm gold lights of the Sterling Ridge Ballroom in Portland, where more than 320 doctors, board directors, and medical donors gathered to celebrate his 42-year milestone in cardiac surgery. I stood near the back of the room, half in the shadows, watching him on stage as he accepted his award. His white hair glowing beneath the chandelier, his confidence radiating in a room built entirely to praise him. Anyone looking at him would have seen a man at the height of his legacy. All I saw was the distance between us, a distance carved slowly over a decade of dismissive comments and silent disappointments, especially when it came to me and the career he believed was beneath his name. I could already predict the script of his speech. He had used the same tone for years whenever he spoke about the medical world, the patients he saved, the breakthroughs he contributed to the respect he had earned. None of it was untrue, but it only highlighted how little he understood my world, the one he had never once stepped into. As he shifted into the part of the speech that acknowledged the people who made this journey possible, my stomach tightened. He called my older brother first, praising him as a rising star in internal medicine. His voice swelling with pride only reserved for one son. Then he turned toward the section of tables where I stood, and the room followed his gaze. My throat tightened even before he opened his mouth. "And this," he said, pausing just long enough for my palms to sweat, "is my son, Adam. He teaches preschool, basically babysitting, but it suits him." His voice carried easily through the speakers, triggering a ripple of laughter across the ballroom, the kind of polite laughter that stings more because people think it is harmless. Heat crawled up my neck as the sound echoed around me. I stayed still, fingers curling into the fabric of my pocket, closing around my phone like it was an anchor. For a moment I thought I might walk out, but I forced myself to remain in place, jaw locked. I had heard versions of that line my whole adult life, how teaching was not real work, how I had wasted my intelligence, how anyone could do what I did. But hearing it amplified through a microphone on his biggest night was something entirely different. The humiliation settled in my chest like something sharp. My phone buzzed. A new email flashed onto the screen. Appointment letter attached. Ellington Foundation. I did not open it. I did not need to. I already knew what was inside, and I knew the truth in that message had the power to flip the dynamic of this entire night. But I kept it tucked away, burning like a secret between my ribs. This was not the moment to reveal anything. Not yet. Then I saw her, Karen Ellington, the chair of the Ellington Foundation, slipping into the ballroom and moving quietly toward the front. She was not listed as a guest. She certainly was not here to applaud my father's medical achievements. Her presence was a warning, a shift in air pressure before a storm. I watched her step closer to the stage, and I realized with startling clarity that something was about to change, not just for my father, but for me. The laughter in that ballroom pulled me backward through time, back to a house perched on Laurelhurst, where the Walker family had dinner together every night at 6 sharp. My father would sit at the head of the long walnut table reciting the day's surgical victories, as if reporting to an eager classroom. He talked about arteries like storylines and cardiac anomalies like plot twists. My mother Susan nodded. My brother David asked technical questions, and I sat quietly waiting for a moment to tell him about the first student who learned to write her name or the child who finally overcame separation anxiety. But he never asked, and when I tried to share anyway, he would offer a brief, distracted smile before shifting back to medicine, the language of the house. My desire to teach was always treated like a temporary phase, something he assumed I would outgrow once I found my real path. When I told him I wanted to apply to Oregon State University for early childhood education, the disappointment on his face was so sharp it felt like a reprimand. My mother stayed silent, folding napkins, while he told me I was wasting a perfectly good brain. I still remember standing in the hallway afterward, acceptance letter in hand, trying to convince myself that my choices mattered even if he thought they did not. Years later, when I defended my master's thesis on early neurodevelopment and intervention timing, he did not show up. He told me afterward that he had been scheduled for last-minute on-call hours, only for me to learn later from a colleague of his that he had attended a dinner with other surgeons. It was not the absence that hurt. It was the ease with which he pretended my work did not deserve his presence. Family gatherings only deepened the pattern. At birthdays and holiday parties, he introduced me the same way every time. Adam works with kids. Something in early education, I think. The smile on his face never matched the pride he had for my brother's growing list of achievements and titles. I stood by, politely reminding myself that the children in my classroom recognized my worth even when he did not. But one memory lodged itself deeper than the rest. The day I graduated with my master's, my father shook hands with my academic advisor and said, "It is a shame the program does not challenge its students more." He meant it as a joke. But the comment landed like a verdict. I swallowed the hurt back then, convincing myself his approval did not matter. But tonight, hearing him reduce my career in front of hundreds of people, I felt all those buried moments pushing to the surface. For the first time, I did not push them back down. Tonight, the narrative he had built about me was about to unravel. And for once, I would not be the one standing quietly while he told my story for me. 3 months before the gala, long before I knew the shape the night would take, an email from the Ellington Foundation arrived in my inbox while I was cleaning up finger paints and alphabet blocks after class. The subject line was so stark it did not feel real at first. Interview invitation, Director of Education. I opened it twice just to make sure the words did not change. It was a position that almost never opened, responsible for overseeing statewide educational medical grant allocations. A role with real influence, real reach, something far greater than the classroom walls I had spent years defending. And yet, I did not tell my parents. I knew exactly how that conversation would go. My father would dismiss it as another frivolous detour in my life. My mother Susan would quietly avoid choosing a side, and my brother David would ask whether I planned to continue playing school forever. Some news deserved protection, at least until it became solid. A week later, at a family dinner, I had been invited to out of obligation more than desire. The email notification flashed across my phone screen as I absent-mindedly checked the time. My father's fork froze midair. "No phones at the table," he snapped, as if I were 10 years old again, and not a grown man with a career he refused to acknowledge. I put the phone away and kept the news to myself. It did not belong to them. Not yet. As the interview date approached, my father began assigning me tasks for his gala, as if I were staff instead of his son. When I finally told him that I would not be available to help set up, because I had an important appointment, he went silent for a moment, the way he always did before his anger sharpened. Important, he repeated as if testing the word. Important enough to skip helping your own family. I tried to explain that this was not something I could reschedule, but he cut me off, accusing me of being selfish, of never stepping up, of hiding behind a job so insignificant that missing one day would not matter to anyone. Something inside me broke in a way that felt strangely calm. For the first time, I did not swallow his words. I told him quietly but firmly that my work mattered more than he ever gave it credit for. The silence on the phone shifted from anger to disbelief. Then came the line he always used when he wanted to end a conversation in his favor. If it is more important than your family, then go. It was meant to shame me back into obedience. Instead, it clarified everything. After we hung up, I sat in the dark of my apartment and let the weight of what I knew settle inside me. Northwest Regional Medical Center. His hospital had submitted an $8 million grant request to the Ellington Foundation, and the position I was interviewing for had direct oversight over grants like his. I had not asked for this collision, but it was coming all the same. Whether he believed in the value of my work or not, the truth was heading toward him, and neither of us could stop it. The morning of the interview, I stood at the base of Ellington Tower, staring up at the glass building that reflected the entire downtown skyline. Walking inside felt like stepping into a version of my life I was not entirely sure I deserved. But every step into the marble lobby, every floor the elevator climbed, pushed me further away from the shadow I had lived under for years. By the time I reached the 42nd floor, my heartbeat had steadied into something sharper than nerves. Determination, maybe, or defiance. 4 people waited for me in the conference room. Karen Ellington, at the head of the table, composed and unreadable. Dr. Laura Benson, whom I knew by reputation, and 2 board members whose names I immediately forgot in the blur of the moment. When they asked me to introduce myself, I spoke not about my father or my family name, but about the work that had shaped me. My classroom, the research I had done on early neurodevelopment, the pilot program I built with pediatric therapists to identify delays before they hardened into obstacles. For the first time in front of people who mattered, I felt seen. Then Karen slid a stack of folders across the table. She wanted me to review sample proposals and discuss which ones demonstrated strong integration between healthcare and early education. I read each file with a focus sharpened by years of doing the kind of work most people never noticed. I pointed out vague language missing metrics, weak educational plans disguised as outreach. The board members seemed surprised by how directly I spoke, but Karen only nodded, taking notes. When I reached the final folder, something in me paused. Northwest Regional Medical Center, my father's hospital. A request for $8 million to expand the pediatric cardiac wing. And tucked into the back, barely filling half a page, was the so-called educational component. 2 short paragraphs of promises without proof. No curriculum, no implementation plan, no qualified educators, nothing that met the standards they claimed to value. I felt my chest tighten, but not with panic, with clarity. Karen asked my assessment, unaware of the blood tie threaded through the application. I forced myself to answer as honestly as I had with the others. I explained that the proposal was medically strong but educationally hollow, that it lacked substance and structure, that it appeared more like a checkbox than a real commitment. She listened, expression unchanged. When I finished, the room was quiet until Dr. Laura Benson set down her pen and looked directly at me. "You know who submitted this, do you not?" There was no point pretending. I nodded once. I told them I would recuse myself from any formal evaluation involving my family, but that my feedback today was based purely on professional standards. Something in the room shifted, not doubt, respect. Karen leaned back, studying me with the same calm precision I had seen in her earlier. Then she told me what I had not allowed myself to hope for. I was the strongest candidate they had seen, and she was taking my name to the board that evening. The decision was not final, but it was close enough to feel real. When I stepped out of Ellington Tower, The air felt different, crisp, electric, almost weightless. But underneath it all was the growing realization that the truth I carried was heading straight toward my father, and there was no version of this story where he would be ready for it. The moment I stepped out of Ellington Tower, the late afternoon air felt sharper than it should have, as if the city itself understood that something in my life had shifted. My phone began buzzing almost immediately. First my father, then my mother, then my brother, all calling in frantic repetition. I let the screen light up and dim again without answering. I knew exactly what those calls meant and what words were waiting for me on the other end. There was no version of the conversation where I would not be pushed, pressured, or guilted into undoing what I had accomplished only an hour earlier, and I was not ready to hear any of it. But silence only lasts so long. My mother's name appeared again, and this time guilt made me pick up. Her voice was tight, strained, the way it always was when she was caught between my father's expectations and my feelings. She told me he was furious that I needed to come to the hotel right away, that he had counted on me for days to help finalize his gala arrangements. I could hear the tension behind her words, the fear of disappointing him, the weight she had carried for decades and quietly passed to me. I told her I would be there, but I did not promise more than that. Minutes later, my father called. His voice did not start with anger. It started with accusation. He demanded to know if I really intended to ignore the needs of my family for some appointment. He reminded me again that tonight was the pinnacle of his career, a moment he had earned through sacrifice, and I was jeopardizing it by choosing something that, in his words, could not possibly matter more than being present for your own father. I let him speak, letting every familiar barb hit me without sinking this time. When he paused long enough for me to respond, I told him the truth that the interview could change my life in ways he had not even tried to imagine. There was a quiet beat, as if he did not quite know how to process the idea that I was standing up for myself. Then he dismissed it with a scoff. He shifted tactics the way he always did when logic did not work. He said he had invited Dr. Laura Benson to the gala, convinced her presence would motivate me to show up earlier. He did not know she had sat across from me that very morning in the interview room, that she had listened to my vision and my plans with a respect he had never offered me. He thought invoking her name would make me fall in line. Instead, it revealed just how little he understood about where my life was headed. Before I could even gather a response, he delivered the line that made my stomach turn. If I arrived late, he said I should not expect to stand with the family on stage. He said it calmly, as if stripping me of belonging was a fair consequence. I felt a small tremor in my chest, but I did not retreat. I told him I was not stepping onto that stage for his approval. I never had been. We hung up without resolution, without understanding. A few seconds later, my phone vibrated again. This time, it was not my father. It was the Ellington Foundation. "Your appointment has been approved." The words were clean quiet, almost gentle, yet they hit me with force. I stood still on the sidewalk, letting people weave around me, realizing I was holding something my father could never have anticipated. Something he had spent years convincing himself I was not capable of earning. When I finally walked into the Hawthorne Plaza Hotel, the gala preparations were in full swing. Staff members rushed across the lobby adjusting centerpieces and testing sound systems. My family was nowhere in sight. They were upstairs with the organizers performing the final rituals for my father's perfect night. I was not there to assist. I was not there to smooth anything over. I was there because I needed to see with my own eyes how the truth would unravel when my father stood on stage and introduced me as the son who babysits. I did not know exactly how the night would unfold, only that nothing would play out the way he thought it would. When I entered the ballroom, the seats were already filled and the lights had dimmed to frame the stage where my father stood at the center, bathed in a halo of white light. The applause that welcomed him was thunderous, the kind of applause that follows a lifetime of prestige. I made my way to table 14, placed deliberately away from the family section at his request. As I sat, I could see my mother in the front row, hands folded tightly, my brother flanking my father with easy, comfortable pride. They fit the image he wanted to project. I never had. My father began his speech, and the room leaned in. He spoke about emergency surgeries, midnight calls, and decades spent saving lives. He spoke well. He always did. And the audience listened out of respect he had unquestionably earned. But beneath the pride in his voice, I could hear something else. Something that had shaped my entire childhood. The certainty that his work mattered more than anyone else's. Then came the part I had been dreading. He invited my brother to stand and praised him for carrying the family legacy forward, calling him the future of cardiac innovation. The applause rose again, warm and genuine. When it died down, he turned toward table 14 toward me. I kept my eyes steady, even as the familiar unease crept into my chest. His smile changed, tightening just enough to let me know what was coming. "And this is my younger son, Adam," he said, his tone dipping into mock affection. "He teaches preschool, which, if we are being honest, is basically babysitting." Laughter rippled instantly, a casual wave across the room. People laughed because he made it sound like a joke, because belittling me was something he did with such ease that they assumed it must be harmless. They had no idea how many times I had heard that same line. As the sound faded, I looked toward the entrance and saw her Karen Ellington stepping inside the ballroom. She was not smiling. She was not making herself small, and she was not here to be discreet. She moved with a purpose that made the air feel different. And I knew then that the night was about to veer into unfamiliar territory. My father continued speaking, shifting from harmless anecdotes to stories that exposed more than he realized. He told the crowd how I had always lacked drive, how I chose Oregon State University over medical school, despite having the capacity for more, how my ambitions seemed limited to crayons and playmats. His voice carried the smugness of someone certain he held the room in his palm. What he did not see was how the audience began to shift, sensing unease beneath the laughter. Just as he prepared to transition into the award segment, the event coordinator received a signal from the back of the room. He cleared his throat and stepped toward the microphone. "Before we move on, we have a special guest who would like to say a few words." The room turned as Karen Ellington walked toward the stage. My father's face stiffened the moment he recognized her. She reached the steps, ascended with calm authority, and stood beside him before facing the audience. Then she turned to him, her voice clear and steady. "Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Walker. It was interesting, but you may want to sit down now because I think everyone here deserves to know who your son actually is." I watched the color drain from his face, watched his grip tighten on the edge of the podium. In that split second, I understood something I had never fully grasped before. For the first time in his life, he was no longer in control. Not of his narrative, not of mine, and not of the room that had worshipped him for 42 years. And I knew with absolute certainty that the night was only just beginning. When Karen Ellington stepped onto the stage, the entire ballroom seemed to tighten around her presence. 320 doctors, administrators, donors, and family acquaintances. All fell silent at once, as if someone had pressed a hand against the air and held it still. My father stood frozen beside the podium, the award in his hand, glinting under the lights. He had no idea what was coming. He had no idea that the narrative he had controlled for decades was about to slip right out of his grip. Karen began gently, her tone respectful. She praised his 42 years of service, his dedication, his countless nights in operating rooms. People nodded along, and for a moment my father's shoulders relaxed, reassured that this interruption would only polish his image further. Then she shifted, her expression tightened with purpose as she addressed the room. "There is something important that needs to be clarified tonight," she said. And I felt every muscle in my body coil. Whatever she was about to reveal would change not only the dynamic between me and my father, but the way this entire room saw us both. She announced that the Ellington Foundation had appointed a new director of education. someone who would oversee, evaluate, and approve statewide medical grant applications tied to early intervention and community education. The title alone stirred a ripple of confusion across the ballroom. When she said my name, I heard the collective gasp behind me. People who had laughed minutes earlier turned around in their seats, eyes wide, their expressions shifting from amusement to disbelief. A few physicians whispered to one another, shocked that the preschool teacher my father mocked had stepped into a role that held real authority in their world. I stood up from table 14. The path to the stage felt longer than it should have, and the silence was so deep that my footsteps echoed. When I reached the platform, Karen placed a steady hand on my shoulder before turning toward the audience again. She held up a folder, the proposal from Northwest Regional Medical Center. This, she said, is one of the largest applications currently under review, and Dr. Walker's son will be the one overseeing its evaluation process. My father's face drained of color. He had not known. He had celebrated himself without realizing the very institution bearing his legacy now depended on my standards. When she handed me the microphone, my fingers trembled for a moment, but my voice came out steady. I spoke about the importance of early childhood education, not as an afterthought, not as babysitting, but as the foundation of all neurological, emotional, and academic development. I explained how early language motor coordination and emotional regulation play crucial roles in how future patients describe symptoms, follow medical guidance, and survive crisis. I reminded them that every surgeon, every physician, every professional in that room had once been a child, learning to hold a pencil, describe discomfort, ask for help, and trust adults. The room shifted. Some physicians nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what they had overlooked. Others looked uncomfortable, perhaps reconsidering the laughter they had shared earlier. I made sure my last words were clear, steady, deliberate. I intend to uphold the highest standards in this role, and that applies to every institution in this state, including the one where my father works. When I set the microphone back down, the director signaled the transition back to the program, but nothing felt the same. My father stared at the floor, unable to reclaim the certainty he had walked onto that stage with. In his eyes I saw confusion, pain, and something I had never witnessed from him before. Fear. When the gala ended, the dynamic of the room had entirely shifted. Doctors, administrators, and researchers approached me with genuine curiosity, asking about intervention strategies, about community programs, about the role I would play in future funding decisions. Some apologized quietly for laughing earlier. Others simply tried to understand how they had misjudged me for so long. Across the ballroom, my father stood alone, no longer surrounded by admirers. For the first time that evening, no one hurried to shake his hand or praise him. The isolation seemed to swallow him whole. When he finally walked over to me, he forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I am proud of you," he said, the words stiff, as if they had been dragged out of a deep, reluctant place. I looked at him and felt something settle inside me. Not anger, but clarity. "Pride means nothing," I said, "when it only appears because I hold authority now. I do not need you to be proud of me. I just need you to respect what I do." He lowered his gaze, the facade cracking in small, subtle ways. Over the next few weeks, he called more than he had in the past 7 years, combined not to ask about my life, but to inquire about the grant proposal. Northwest Regional Medical Center had been told their initial submission lacked the educational depth required. He asked if I could advise him. I told him all communication had to go through the Ellington Foundation office, no exceptions. He did not argue. He knew he could not. The revised proposal arrived months later, tightened but still insufficient. The board approved only $4.5 million instead of the requested $8 million. It was not my decision. I had formally recused myself, but the standards my team enforced were strict. For once, my father had to navigate a system he could not charm or command. In the days that followed, something shifted in him. He began reading articles I had recommended years ago. He asked for research on early neurodevelopment. And one morning he called to ask a question that stunned me. Could I visit your classroom? I agreed. Not for validation, not to prove myself, but because I wanted him to understand the world I had built without him. When he arrived, he sat in a tiny chair among 5-year-olds, awkwardly trying to help a child grip a pair of scissors correctly. His hands, the same hands that had performed hundreds of life-saving operations, trembled as he guided a child through cutting a single straight line. I watched quietly from the back of the room, feeling an unexpected mix of sadness and sympathy. For the first time, he was not the surgeon or the authority or the patriarch. He was just a man trying to understand something he had dismissed for decades. After class, he looked at me, eyes softer than I had ever seen. "Now I understand why you chose this," he said. I did not rush to reassure him. I did not fill the silence with forgiveness. I let him sit with the realization he had earned on his own. When I finally spoke, it was simple. You do not have to understand everything. You just need to know that no job is small. He nodded slowly without protest. That was new. That mattered. As I walked out of the room, the weight I had carried for years felt lighter. Not because I had won, but because I had stopped trying to. I did not need to fit into his world anymore. I did not need to shrink myself to keep the peace. I had stepped out of the shadow he cast, not by defeating him, but by choosing myself. And from that moment on, I lived not by permission, but by my own decisions. In the quiet, after my father left the classroom, I stayed behind for a moment, letting the stillness settle around me. The tiny chairs, the scattered crayons, the unfinished drawings taped to the walls. This was the world I had chosen long before anyone thought it mattered. For years, I had carried the belief that I needed to justify this choice to him, that I had to prove something to a man who did not believe anything meaningful could happen inside a room full of children. But watching him struggle with a pair of child-safe scissors, watching his certainty unravel into humility, I realized something profound. The validation I had spent half my life searching for had never been his to give, and the power he held over me had only ever been the power I handed him. Walking home that evening, Portland's late daylight filtered through the clouds in a soft, gray-gold haze. People hurried past me. Parents, students, nurses in scrubs, still smelling faintly of antiseptic, construction workers, commuters. I thought about all the invisible work happening in those lives. The work no one stands on a stage to applaud. Work that is not glamorous or headline-worthy, but that sustains entire communities. It struck me then how many people must know this feeling of being underestimated, dismissed, or overshadowed by someone who believes their achievements are worth more. How many people shrink themselves and their own families just to keep the peace? How many carry the weight of someone else's expectations like an anchor tied to their ribs? I used to think smallness was safety. That if I stayed quiet, if I stayed agreeable, if I stayed in the background, I could avoid conflict. But living quietly came with its own kind of ache. The ache of being unseen in the place where it mattered most. And on the night of the gala, when my father used the microphone to turn my existence into a punchline, something inside me finally refused to stay quiet. The truth is, the moment Karen said my name, the room did not just shift for him, it shifted for me. For the first time, I saw the distance between who I had been taught to be and who I actually was. And once you see that distance clearly, you cannot unsee it. You cannot go back to making yourself smaller for someone who refuses to grow. My father and I are not suddenly healed. Respect is being rebuilt brick by brick, not handed down in a single conversation.